So this video is all about multiplying and dividing with negative numbers. And what we're going to focus on in order to talk about it is the multiplying aspect of multiplying and dividing with negative numbers. Once we understand how multiplication works, because of the way that multiplication and division are related, we can actually extend those same rules into dividing. When we talked about addition and subtraction in previous lessons, we noticed that they were similar, and we could flip between them using the strategies that we talked about with subtraction, but multiplication and division are actually even more closely related. So if we talk about multiplication, we can extend it immediately up into division. But when we get started, much like we did on the other video lessons, we want to talk about what does multiplication actually mean. Because if we understand what multiplication means, we can understand how to interpret it with negative numbers. So pause the video, write down a few thoughts that you have, and come back when you are ready to move on. So one way that we talk about multiplication is as many copies of the same group, and that really helps with positive numbers. That's the way we're going to think about multiplication when we get to fractions. That's the way we're going to think about multiplication when it's related to division, when we get to fractions too. So in certain ways, this is a really helpful thing to do. But much like a lot of the ways that we start talking about operations in elementary schools and lower schools, the first thing that comes to mind is often restricted to just positive numbers, because copies of the same group in the physical world doesn't necessarily make as much sense with negative numbers as it does with positive. So we want to think about a few different ways to do it. Another way that we talked about multiplication initially is a number of objects in an array, a number of rows and a number of columns, and when we count up the objects, we find the number of objects in the array, and then the rows times the columns are how we envision multiplication. And then that gets extended into what the definition of multiplication is and the way that we're going to interpret it through negative numbers, which is multiplication is repeated addition. We add the same thing to itself each time. So if we have 8 boxes in each row, that number 8 gets added to itself 6 times. So we call it 8 times 6 because 8 is added to itself 6 times, similar to the way that powers are repeated multiplication. So if we take that idea of repeated addition, we can start to look at what it means when we multiply a positive times a negative. We're going to skip a positive times a positive because you're very familiar with that. But the scenario that we can think about for a positive times a negative number, when we're looking at something like what is 5 times negative 8, is, well, what if you spent, because that's what negative numbers can mean when it comes to money, what if you spent $8 on something 5 times? So if you had a book that you're really interested in buying and you saw 5 books that you're interested in buying and you spent $8 on all of them. We can use that to think about what is 5 times negative 8. Well, we could say this is 5 added to itself negative 8 times, but we're not entirely sure what adding something to itself a negative number of times would be. So we can say that this is negative 8 added to itself 5 times. So negative 8 plus negative 8 plus negative 8 plus negative 8 plus negative 8. Add those all together, and that's negative 40. So 5 times negative 8 is negative 40. And we did that by using the definition of multiplication as repeated addition, negative 8 added to itself 5 times. Let's see if that same kind of idea works when we have another type of problem. So if we have 4 times negative 12. So go ahead and take a second. You don't have to pause the video. I'm going to give it about 3 or 4 seconds of dead airspace here, just for you to think about what do you predict based on what we saw before with 5 times negative 8 being negative 40. What do you predict 4 times negative 12 is going to be? Think about that, and then we'll go through the repeated addition here in a second. So again, we could look at this as 4 added to itself negative 12 times, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So instead we're going to do negative 12 added to itself 4 times, negative 12 plus negative 12 plus negative 12 plus negative 12. Altogether, that ends up as negative 48, which is convenient because 4 times 12 itself is 48. But when we do 4 times negative 12, we end up with negative 48. And it turns out that that pattern that we're looking at there, when we have a negative number times a positive number, we can always think about it as that negative number added to itself the positive number of times. And when we add a series of negative numbers, we always add up with the negative numbers because we're moving farther and farther and farther left on the number line. So a positive times a negative has that predictable pattern to it. And so something like negative 5 times 3, when we're looking at fact families, coming back from first or second grade, where you may have seen fact triangles, we have negative 5, and we have 3, and we multiply those together to get negative 15. And it would look something like this, and we rewrote it in terms of multiplication and division. So we can see when we're connecting these ideas, if negative 5 times 3 is negative 15, then negative 15 divided by 3 is going to have to be negative 5. Because that's how fact families are related. We can move those numbers around according to those sets of operations. So in both multiplication and division, when you have one positive number and you have one negative number, your product or your quotient is going to end up being negative. Since division is the inverse operation of multiplication, we can just extend those rules from multiplication into division. So far what we know is that positive times positive, or positive divided by positive, is positive. But if we have positive times negative, or positive divided by negative, or flipping those around, that the result is negative. I'm not going to ask you to pause the video yet to write this down because we have one more step to go through. And that's the question of what happens when we have two negative numbers. So let's take a look at negative 5 times negative 3. Well, we can do a little bit with factors because we know we can split some numbers apart. We know that negative 5 is actually the same as negative 1 times 5. Or we could look at it that way because 5 times 1 is 5, so 5 times negative 1 is negative 5. Now, multiplication is associative, so we can put some parentheses around here and do the 5 times negative 3 first. Well, 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. And the way we think about negative 1 times a number is, what is the opposite of negative 15? Well, the opposite of negative 15 is a positive 15. And if I clean that up a little bit by typing it out, negative 1 times negative 15 in this step here, being just the opposite of negative 15, the opposite of a negative number is a positive number. And so even though it seems a little bit crazy, two negative numbers multiplied by itself are the opposite of a negative number, which is a positive number. So those three rules that we have, we either have two positive numbers, in which case our product or quotient is positive. We have two negative numbers, in which case our product or quotient is positive also, or we have a positive and a negative, or a negative and a positive, in which case our product and quotient is negative. And it all comes down, like in addition, to, are the signs the same or are the signs different? If the signs are the same, our product or quotient is positive. If our signs are different, our product or quotient is negative. And this is the step that I'm going to have you write down. So the rules for multiplying and dividing integers: the same sign creates a positive product or quotient, different signs create a negative product or quotient. Go ahead and write this down. We'll do some example problems and I'll give you some practice problems to work on. So let's look at some example problems here, again going only through multiplication. Now the first thing we want to know is that 15 times 12 is 180. And we're going to use that to go through the rest of it, because the process for multiplying and dividing is just do the multiplication or division and then slap on the sign. So all of these are going to have an absolute value of 180, and the question is, what's their sign going to be? Well, in the upper left-hand corner, we have a positive times a negative, so our product is negative. In the lower left-hand corner, we have a negative times a positive, so our product is negative because they have different signs. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have a negative times a negative. They have the same sign, so even though they're both negative, their product is positive. So when you're doing the multiplication and division, you just do the multiplication or division. Then you add the sign at the end according to what signs your original factors had or what signs your dividend and divisor had. So go ahead, pause the video, work on these multiplication problems here. Remember, if they have the same sign, your product is positive. If they have different signs, your product is negative, and come back when you are ready to move on. So in the upper left-hand corner, 12 times 7 is 84. But we have a positive and a negative, different signs gives us a negative 84. In the lower left-hand corner, 17 times 2 is just 34. That's our familiar positive multiplication. In the upper right-hand corner, negative 11 times negative 11. 11 times 11 is 121, but they have the same signs, so our product is positive. And in the lower right-hand corner, negative 18 times negative 4. 18 times 4 is 72. A negative times a negative is a positive because they are the same signs, so the same signs in multiplication gives us a positive, so our product is 72. And so the big thing to remember about multiplying and dividing negative numbers is that if our factors or a dividend and divisor have the same sign, our product or quotient is positive, and if they have different signs, the product or quotient is negative. You just do multiplication and division as you're familiar with doing it, and then add the sign at the end according to what signs our original numbers have.